Dr. Vince Vitale. It's my guest this afternoon. And Vince is here because this week he has just launched a book which he's co-authored with Ravi Zacharias entitled Why Suffering? Finding Meaning and Comfort When Life Doesn't Make Sense. And actually, we discovered at the launch yesterday that the first lot has already sold out. So it's already gone for a reprint. So this is clearly a very relevant topic, Vince. And my first question to you is, how did you get into this subject?
Sure. Thanks, Simon. I wasn't a Christian when I showed up at university as a 18, 19-year-old.
This afternoon. And Vince is here because this week he has just...
I wasn't a Christian when I showed up at university. Thank you. And I was studying philosophy. And so these sorts of questions are really important to me right from the beginning of my own personal journey, asking questions about suffering and about other things where I thought at the time, actually, Christianity was a bit crazy and couldn't really be defended intellectually. So it's an important part of my own sort of story. At the same time, we also dealt with quite a bit of suffering in my family history. I think if you ask anyone in my extended family who has had the most significant impact on our family, they would probably name the two people who suffered most, who both had serious disabilities that caused them to suffer most, and yet also had the deepest and sort of most lasting impact on my family. Through this time that I began to research on these ideas, I then wound up doing my PhD research in this area. My dad was struggling through some serious health problems, and all of that. So both the personal side and the philosophical side were there. And I found that as I started to think about this question and started to research and write about it, everywhere I would go to talk about it, people always had, whatever question I was talking about, people always had this question. And so I really wanted to spend time thinking about a question that people have, so that my philosophical studies could actually be useful.
That's interesting. I mean, obviously I have some specific questions on the content of the book, but just tell me a little bit about the process of arriving at writing the book. You've co-authored it with Ravi. I mean, how did you go about writing a book together, and how did you sort of pool your ideas and come to a consensus? And
yeah, it was sort of a nice process for us, actually. The idea for the book initially came from the publisher.
Right.
Ravi and I happened to be at a conference together, and the publisher heard us both speak on relevant issues, and then he went to Ravi and said, have you ever thought about doing a joint book on suffering? That was probably 4 years ago. So there was a time lapse there during which we just had conversations on this topic and tried to figure out if our ideas and our thinking on this was compatible, and we found that it was. The approach of the book is that each chapter offers a different response to the question of why suffering. And so it's sort of a cumulative case approach, and that lent itself to a joint project because each of the chapters could be reasonably distinct in terms of the content that they were dealing with. And what we found was that Ravi, growing up in India as an Easterner, has a certain perspective on some of the issues related to this topic. Me, trained as a Western philosopher, I have a certain perspective on some of these topics. And so we felt like between the two of us, we could say more than perhaps we could individually. And I guess that would be my recommendation if someone was thinking about writing a joint book or not to write it just because you only have half a book to say and the other person only has half a book to say, but if it actually means that together you can say more than you can separately. So that's the approach of the book, and part of the conclusion is that the Christian response to this question is stronger because there are so many different responses that we can offer, and that each of them has something worthwhile to say. We shouldn't expect any one of them to do all of the work, but in the same way that one witness in a courtroom that seems to imply that the defendant is innocent might not be particularly persuasive. But if you had 10 witnesses that all saw 10 different things that all seem to imply that the defendant was innocent, then that might be overwhelmingly convincing. So that's the approach of the book.
Great. Now, I mean, obviously, it's a question that lots of people ask, and people also have a very personal take on it, because suffering is not something that's just a philosophical issue. It's something that is part of our lives, part of the warp and woof of being human. And actually, just to say that, you know, as we're not just going to talk here for the next 40 minutes, we do want to invite you to ask questions online, and we're happy to well, I'm happy to ask them, and I'll ask Vince to answer them.
I was going to say the other way around.
Exactly. But let me kick off with a couple. So you mentioned this just in your introduction there, but help us understand how you can either do it at the level of the conversation between you and Ravi, or just more philosophically, the sort of difference between the Eastern approach to these issues and a more Western approach, and obviously particularly the religious expressions that we most associate with East and West, and how they approach the subject of suffering a bit differently.
Sure. I was really blessed to have Ravi on the project, in particular as an Easterner and a Westerner, really, having moved to Canada and then the US. He has a really good grasp of the diversity of ways that different religions approach this topic, and that a variety of worldviews do. So he was able to dig into that, and I think one of the things that shows is that the Christian response to this question is pretty distinctive.
Yeah,
is really a unique response. So he has a chapter where he looks at a variety of different worldviews and their take on the question of suffering. So he looks at Hinduism and says here the primary concept is one of karma. It's one of you having deserved the suffering that you're dealing with, either in this life or perhaps in a past life. And he shows how actually that's not the response that Jesus gave. Jesus seemed quite explicit in a couple of places, both with a man who was born blind, and some of Jesus' disciples says, was it he who sinned, or was it his parents who sinned that he was born blind? Jesus said, no, this wasn't a punishment for sin. This was so that the work of God could be displayed, and then he healed the man. There's another instance with the Tower of Siloam, where I think maybe 18 people were crushed. And again, there was the thought that it's just because they were more guilty than others, and Jesus speaks against that. Ravi looks at the Buddhist perspective as well, and this idea that maybe our suffering is in some sense illusory. Maybe in some sense it's because we have desires, and when those desires are not fulfilled, we suffer. And that actually the response to that would be to distance ourselves from our desires, even if that means distancing ourselves from relationships that cause those desires. So if you look at Gautama Buddha and the history of how he approached this question, it was on the night that his wife was giving birth to his son that he left to pursue this life of renunciation of all desires, even the relationships which ultimately could cause him suffering. Ravi would say that's to be very much contrasted with the Christian God, who, rather than running from our suffering, actually ran into our suffering and suffered with us. He looks at Islam as well, and the idea that Allah wills it, and that in Islam there's not perhaps as much space in certain traditions to ask this question of why suffering. And he thinks that that's very important as well. You know, in the Bible, the Christian God is spoken of as Father hundreds and hundreds of times. That's not a term that's used of Allah in the Quran. And from a Christian perspective, that notion of Father is very important. Yes, a father is authoritative, but it's also the case that a father wants you to start to understand some of his ways, because he's interested not only in obedience, but also in a relationship of trust. And then, of course, there's naturalism as well, and someone like Richard Dawkins, who lives around the corner, who would say that there is no good and evil. There's nothing in a material world other than blind, pitiless indifference. And so that's an approach to this question of suffering as well. And there, I think you have an even bigger problem of, can you even call the things that we all recognize as evil objectively evil? So one of the approaches that Ravi takes from having that Eastern perspective and that knowledge of different world religions and worldviews is that, look, this is a question for everyone, not just for Christians. And criticism without alternative is empty. So if you're going to say the Christian response to this question is no good, then what response are you going to put in its place? And he tries to run through a variety of the major responses and say that actually the Christian response and its focus on relationship is quite distinctive. That's one of the approaches that Ravi takes. In my portions of the book, I take a number of approaches as well, one of which grew out of my PhD work, and that would be one that picks up on a Western philosophical tradition in ethics, philosophical ethics, and tries to apply that this question of suffering as well. Do you want me to say a bit about that, or you want
I'll
to
come
move
to
on?
that.
We'll come back to
I've got one rider that I want to ask on that question first,
Sure.
which is before we, arm ourselves with the comprehensive and helpful apologetical questions that you outline here.
Yes.
One of the questions that I think you'll find at the popular level is, I was reading a new survey just this last 24 hours that indicated that 85% of people in Britain think that religion is harmful, which is an incredible statistic. I don't know how they asked that question, but so there is a general population who would say, actually, no matter which religion you're talking about, religion's not the answer. Actually, we live in a culture which says religion's the problem.
Yes.
Now, how do you help I'm not so much asking what the answer to that question is, but I'm asking you, how do you gain an audience in order to have the kind of conversation that you've just begun to articulate?
Yeah, good question and good distinction as well. One of the things that I find really helpful when I talk on this subject, both to audiences, but also personally, is to a certain extent just put my hand up and say, like any tradition, like any community, my community and my tradition, my church has been involved in things that at times have harmed people. I think the church has done a lot of good, and there's really an argument and debate to be had there. But sometimes it helps to just put my hand up. And people often say apologetics is not about apologizing. True, but there's also a place for sometimes just saying, look, if you
we don't always get it right.
Yeah, we don't always get it right. And if you have been hurt by the church or by someone in the church, or you have your experience has been such that you felt like you have been hurt by the church, then I just want to say I'm sorry for that. And I think there can be something really significant about apologizing on behalf of one's family. If my biological family had really wronged someone and they were no longer around to apologize, there could still be something genuinely meaningful about me showing up on their doorstep and saying, on behalf of my family, we have wronged you. Would you give us another chance? Would you think about trusting us again? And I find that sometimes people who perceive themselves to have been wronged by the church, it might not be that there was any specific individual that wronged them, or even if it is, it might be long in the past. They might even not be able to go and have a conversation with that person. Sometimes we can just take responsibility ourselves and ask people if they would give us a second chance to earn their trust. And I find that sometimes that can be very disarming, and that oftentimes people are generous in giving that second chance.
And of course, these questions are never in isolation. So often the why suffering question arises out of people's experience of suffering. And maybe God, in his providential wisdom, uses that to awaken some people, but of course it doesn't have that effect on everybody. So that's part of the context of it. Now, in the first half of the book, it seems to me, between you cover 4 areas, and I want to just give you an opportunity, if I may, to comment on each of them. So, and you've touched on them already, but let's go back to the answer as an academic. So from your academic background as a philosopher, how do you go about answering the question that this book is all about, why suffering? Just try and help us, without being experts in your particular field, understand how you would answer that question.
Yeah, it's an encouraging question to get, because 60 years ago in my discipline of philosophy of religion, I wouldn't have had as much to say from a positive perspective. You go back 60 years or so in the Western philosophy of religion tradition, and claims about God were largely off the table. They weren't considered to be meaningful, let alone true. There's been a real resurgence in the last 55 to 60 years of Christian philosophy, and this has been one of the questions in which that resurgence has really gained a lot of ground. And I think it's fair to say that in the last 50 to 60 years, starting with people like J.L. Mackie and Anthony Flew, there have been 2 major arguments from evil or suffering to the non-existence of God that have been made. One called the logical argument from evil, which tried to show that if evil existed, God would be impossible. And one called the evidential argument from evil, which tried to show that if evil exists, then God is unlikely. And the state of affairs now is that most people concede that the logical argument from evil has been defeated, that it doesn't show that the existence of God is impossible. And most people, I think it's fair to say most people, would now say that the evidential argument from evil is inconclusive, that one could be argued one way or the other. So the sort of state of affairs in philosophy of religion on this question is much more encouraging from a Christian perspective than it was a number of years ago. And part of what we do in the book is try to outline a number of these different philosophical approaches which have made some headway. Some of those approaches have to do with the nature of free will, and that if you're a God who truly desires love, then you will need to have meaningful free will. And once you introduce meaningful free will into a system, then you have the possibility of people choosing against love and against relationship, and suffering resulting from that. Some of those approaches are not particularly free will based, but are based more on the fact that there are certain types of good things that are only possible when certain types of evil are allowed. So you can only get the virtue of courage if you're in a dangerous situation. You can only be empathetic if there's someone suffering to be empathetic towards. One way of thinking about this is sometimes to think of 2 or 3 of the greatest lives that you think have ever been lived, the sort of lives that you think that's the sort of life really holding up as admirable and celebrating and rejoicing over. And then hypothetically try to strip away all of the suffering that was relevant to that life, relevant to the culture that the person grew up in, relevant to any injustice that they fought against, relevant to any relationships that included suffering that they cared for people through. You strip all of that away, and all of a sudden you think those lives don't look anything like the great lives that we were initially so inclined to celebrate. Another approach, I'll just mention this last one, there are others as well, but another approach in the philosophical literature which has really gained a lot of traction is called skeptical theism. Not the best name, but the idea is basically, imagine you were a 5-year-old and you were told, we're going to move city. Your parents told you you're going to move city. You might experience that as one of the worst things that could possibly happen. And it might legitimately be very difficult on you as a 5-year-old. That doesn't mean that your parents don't love you. It doesn't mean that your parents didn't make that decision with your interest in mind, or they didn't even make that decision for the best interest of the family. And it might only be from a much later perspective and from a more mature perspective where you're able to see more of what your parents might have been thinking, that you could look back and see that actually that could have been a decision, while a difficult decision still could be one that a good and loving parent could make. And so the question arises, if God does have good reasons for allowing some of the suffering that he allows, how confident should we be, if he exists and he has those good reasons, that we would know what those reasons are?
Yeah.
And many people have come to think, while we might understand some of God's reasons, we shouldn't have the sort of overconfidence which would say we should understand all of his reasons. And if that's the case, then the fact that we don't see all of his reasons can't be strong evidence that in fact he doesn't have them.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And actually, that has a spin-on sort of more popular level application, because I'm thinking about a couple of things that you refer to, the issue of pain, for example, and that we know that, out of the examples that you've just cited, that no 2 people respond to those kind of circumstances in the same way. So, as we sometimes say, suffering can make people bitter or better, and their prior disposition or outlook or philosophical worldview can affect that. And I was also struck that, the book that Philip Yancey wrote with Paul Brand, in which I think it was called The Problem of Pain. No, that's C.S. Lewis. Anyway, the issue of pain being a gift of God to awaken us, which is something that C.S. Lewis also spoke about, that won't awaken everybody.
Yes. So
there's something else going on other than the pain itself.
Yes.
But it actually is something that in his providence he can use. And Ravi says in the book, that the pain is, in that respect, is a gift, in the same way that Paul Brand found that the leprosy patients he was teaching, had to have something to help them be aware of pain because they couldn't feel it naturally.
Yes. So I think that's a nice way of putting it. God can turn something into a gift, which was perhaps not intended as a gift in the first place, in the sense that it may be that there are some decisions that we make and that we're responsible for, where we do things that are against God's laws, against what God desires in some sense, and yet he can take things which we meant for evil, and he can turn them for good. I think that's true. And I think the important thing with all of these responses, and this is one of the reasons why we like that there are a lot of responses in this book. A different response is going to be most helpful for a different person. Yeah. Everyone experiences, as you said, everyone experiences suffering very differently. And it might be that the response that's most helpful at one time is not helpful at all at another time, but another response is helpful. And the first conversation I had after I became a Christian 14 years ago on this topic was one where my Aunt Regina raised with me how difficult it was to see her son, my cousin Charles, suffer from a serious mental illness. And I, at the time, just hearing the question, not seeing the questioner, just hearing the question, I just started responding with some of my philosophical responses. And she listened to me patiently, graciously. Then she turned to me and she said, but Vince, that doesn't speak to me as a mother. That wasn't the time for the philosophical response. And I later got to know the scriptures better and found that Jesus certainly realized that when Lazarus died, John 9, and Mary and Martha send for Jesus. He waits a couple days. By the time he gets there, Lazarus has already died. Reading between the lines, Martha and Mary don't seem particularly impressed about that. And when they say to him, "Where were you? If you had been here earlier, my brother would not have died." Surely Jesus could have given an apologetic. He could have given a response. He could have given the reasons he had for waiting as long as he did, but he doesn't give any sort of defense of himself there. He just says that he weeps, and then ultimately he does raise Lazarus. So it's been a real personal journey for me as well, writing this book, figuring out not only what the responses are, but how to talk about them and when to talk about them, and when it's not time to talk about them. It's just time to be there for someone.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for me personally, I remember preaching with passion, having read that Yancey and Brandt book about pain is a gift.
Yes.
And then having a very different perspective on it when I got signed off sick with pneumonia for 3 months, very shortly afterwards, and God may remind us that sort of our faith and our philosophy needs to match a lived personal experience. Absolutely. And I'd be interested, so you moved very helpfully, I think, from how we see this impinging personally and how it might shape the apologetic and the conversations we have with people. Say a little bit more about how you think this will help people who are going through suffering. I mean, you've written a book as a couple of educated philosophers and theologians. What is your hope really at that level?
Yes, we tried to keep the philosophy and the theology strong and sound, but we really tried to write the book for someone without theological training, where someone with the theological training would pick it up and get something out of it, but who didn't have that, and for whom all of these ideas were just very new and the suffering was very raw, would still find it an encouraging and a hopeful book. So there's a lot of story in there. There's a lot of anecdotes. I think that God can communicate information and content just as much through story as he can through propositional argument and philosophy. And so just as much of what we're trying to say through the book is coming through experiences that we've had, through stories that we've been through ourselves. I tell one story of my best friend's father, who died of cancer about a year ago, and he had about 3 weeks left to live. And my best friend Chris said, "Will you go and speak to my father?" And so I went and did. I didn't know if he'd want to talk about the suffering that he was going through. He's a very tough man, not the sort of man who would normally open up and be vulnerable. And he did. He opened up and he said, "I'm scared of what's coming next." And so we began to talk about that, and it became apparent to me through the conversation, Roman Catholic background, and it became apparent to me, not really a churchgoer though, cultural sort of Christianity, and it became apparent to me that his understanding of the central Christian message was try to do more good than bad, and then hope at the end of the day you've done enough.
Balanced it out.
And if that's what you think the Christian message is, well, then of course it's going to be really scary at that point in your life. And so I've never been so thankful to be sitting before someone as a Christian. If I adhered to any of those worldviews that I was talking about earlier, I don't think I would have had much to say. But it's just amazing that even at that point, even in the point of greatest suffering, even at that point where there wasn't much time left, the hope that Christianity offered to my best friend's father was absolutely full. And I could explain the gospel to him, and I could ask him if it made sense. And he said, 69 years, and I've never thought of that. I thought Christianity was one thing. It was something else entirely. And we just had a wonderful moment where he accepted that hope. He accepted Jesus. He asked me if my wife knew this incredible truth about Christianity as well. I said she did. He said, it must be a happy life. And then he said, he kind of paused and he said, now I'm actually looking forward to what's next. So in the book, there is philosophy, but we've been through a lot of stories and a lot of experiences like that, where the hope has not been ideas or arguments or theories, but it's been a person. It's been the person of Jesus introduced to people in a real, tangible, concrete, relational way. And we hope that comes through the book just as much as
no, absolutely it does. And I think the fact that there's a multiple approach that you're taking means that we will find resonance in different ways. I mean, I think of a couple of things that really struck me. I'd never thought about something that is painfully obvious, having sat by the bed of my wife as she gave birth to all three of our children, that a baby comes into the world and they cry. It's the first thing that happens. And what is it? Months down the road, where you're rapt with excitement when they first smile. And I don't know it was a really interesting observation. Now, I don't know, do we think that pre-fall babies might have smiled when they came into the world? Or is that just an interesting symptomatic thing of the human experience of pain when you arrive? And how do you interpret that particular lovely story?
Yes, Ravi's story. So that struck me as well. And I see it as a sign of the brokenness of the world. And there's almost a microcosm there of the Christian story as a whole. The baby comes into the world screaming and in pain. It's usually not too long before wrapped up and sort of resting in a parent's arms. One analogy, I sort of adapted this from actually a philosopher that I was reading. Sometimes you can read philosophy and you find examples that you can then really put to use in a kind of ministry context. But she said it was Eleanor Stump, and this is an adaptation of her analogy, but she said, imagine if aliens, of course philosophers always have to use an example about aliens, but imagine if aliens tapped into a video feed of Earth, but all they could see was the hospital delivery room when I was being born. And they watched those first few moments of life, and they saw my mom in pain. They saw the doctors screaming orders at her. Then when she couldn't take anymore, they saw them get a knife. I was born by cesarean section. They cut her open. I came out, blood everywhere, everyone's screaming. She's reaching out for me. They rushed me away without being able to go into arms. If that was the slice of my life that you saw, you would think those doctors were evil. It's only if you're able to see the whole story that you're able to see that actually not only are they not evil, but they cared for me very well and they saved my mother's life. And from a Christian perspective, this slice of history after the fall and before eternity is just the first few moments of human history. And so there is a real hope that when we see this life, the Christian life, from the perspective of eternity, we'll see it something like that. The baby that comes into existence crying, but before too long is resting in a parent's arms.
So I want to ask a question which several people have been asking, and this has occurred several times during this week, I know.
Probably means it's a tough one.
Well, the question is this, and it'd be good to hear how you respond to this, because we know that the human experience is that every human being is going to suffer.
Yeah.
We know it's not evenly distributed, but every human being will experience suffering. And the question that's occurred several times, I know, during this week is, why would we put our children through that as parents? Why would we bring them into the world when we know that it's going to be painful toil and suffering for every single one of them as a result? And I'd love to hear you articulate your response to that question.
Great question. And this analogy with procreation is one that I pick up in the book. I try to make quite a strong analogy between divine creation on the one hand and human procreation on the other. Interestingly, most of us think that having a child is an okay thing to do. Most of us think most days that even though we know full well that having a child is going to result in significant suffering, because even the most fortunate of human lives include some serious suffering. And it's a really difficult thought, but we even know if we make the choice to voluntarily procreate, we even know that eventually that child will actually die. Really tough thought. And yet we do think that having a child can be a loving thing to do, could even be a courageous thing to do. And that's even if we don't believe in God, perhaps. Maybe there's debate here, but most people don't think belief in God is a requirement in order to for it to be okay for you to have a child, right? So it's not even like you're taking the possibility of an eternal life into account. So why do we think that it could be okay, despite the serious suffering that we've mentioned, to have a child? I think one of the things that shows us is that we can't think that, or let me put it this way, if you think that it is always wrong or in principle wrong to create a person in an environment where you know beforehand that person will experience the possibility of significant suffering, then you're not only going to need to call God evil, you're also going to need to call evil anyone who decides to have a child. And this is part of where philosophy can be helpful at times. You help to show someone, look, you already believe something in one realm, which should be relevant to your beliefs in another realm. You already believe when it comes to having human children that it can be okay to bring people into an environment where there's the possibility of serious suffering, so long as you do it out of love for that child who will come to exist, and with a commitment to care for them through the suffering, and even with a willingness to step into that suffering if need be to see them through it. If that's our intuitions when it comes to human procreation, then why shouldn't it be the same when we talk about divine creation? Unless there's a double standard there. If we take those same intuitions and apply it to divine creation, then again, we shouldn't think that the creation of this sort of world was just an easy decision in every respect. We can understand God feeling the tension between the regret over the suffering that would come, just like a human parent really does feel the tension over, and the worry and the anxiety over the suffering that will come. And yet it could be an act of love, especially if that God was one who was willing to come and suffer alongside us, and even for us, and even by us, if that's what it took to ultimately see us through.
That's suffering. A very, very powerful response to the new atheist who says that religion is evil, and that actually all you're doing is perpetuating something that is enslaving to people. To say to them, you didn't seem to think that when you had children.
Yes.
I mean, it's
well said.
It's quite powerful, really.
Yeah, well said.
That's really helpful. I think just one more comment from me before we wrap up. Time's running past pretty quickly. The intriguing thing is that if you spoke to some of the great saints, whoever you want to put in that category, and you look at what God has used in their life to form them, suffering features. I mean, in everybody's life, we know it's not equally distributed.
Yes.
And somehow, if you were to talk to them about the things that were formative for them in God's economy, it is suffering very often that God has used to shape them. Now, I'm being slightly cautious about the way I'm expressing that, and you can tell me whether you think I need to express that a bit better. But in people I know, they don't say, I wish I could have expunged that. They will often say, in those most awful times, it was also true that now I can look back and see what God was doing. Is that a right way to help people understand personal suffering a little bit? And I'm very cautious about putting it like that. Help me have a voice to say that well.
No, I think it is helpful. I think oftentimes it's helpful before suffering and after suffering.
Yeah.
Not necessarily
during.
helpful during
Yeah.
the suffering, but it doesn't mean it's not helpful. And being able to see that perspective and identify that perspective in other people's lives before you reach a point of serious suffering can actually really help you to cling to God through it, because you have those sort of memory stones, even if they're in other people's lives, of saying, no, I saw the way that God ultimately worked that for good in that person's life, and that person's life, and that person's life. And sometimes after the fact as well, it can help to look back and see, no, I can continue to trust God because now I can see more of this story. So I think that's true. And, one of the reasons that when you look at the saints of Christianity's history, you do find that they've been through quite a lot of suffering. One of the reasons for that is because they put their lives on the line to honor God, but also to help others through suffering. Lots of those biographies that you would read, it would be precisely because they were responding to the question, why suffering, with the personal response of being willing to get their own hands dirty to help others through their suffering, that they wound up suffering in that way. And I think that's a real challenge to us. The Bible talks, 2 Corinthians talks about Jesus being rich and actually becoming poor so that others might be rich. That's a real challenge. Would I be willing to give up, even taking it literally, give up the money that I have and literally become poor so that someone else who is in suffering might become rich? That's a real challenging question for me as a Christian. But the reality is that one of the reasons the church grew, one of the biggest reasons the church grew in the first few centuries, was precisely because Christians were willing to do that. And that's why we still read about them today. One of the reasons the church grew is because through the 2 or 3 big plagues in the first 3 centuries, most of the people who made it through those plagues had a Christian to thank for the fact that they were still alive, because when everyone else was running out of the cities, Christians were running into the cities to help those who were suffering.
Well, Vince, so much. I mean, there's so much more in here, and I hope that those who've logged on have just got a flavor really for what a rich book this is. Particularly grateful for the 2 voices of the both of you, Ravi and Vince, and also the fact that this is a multi-layered response, and really, really grateful for that. So I do commend it to you. I hope that you'll have a chance to buy it and read it. And thank you very much for logging on today. We will continue to do these roughly every month. The next web broadcast is on the 3rd of December, in which we have Dr. Keith Ward, who will be my guest. So also on sort of more philosophical theme, but he'll be launching his new book here at Wycliffe then as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you very much, Vince, for being with us too.
Pleasure. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, everyone.